The gavel struck the table so hard that Eva Sawyer felt it in her chest like a gunshot. "This hearing is concluded," said Judge Harlan Pruitt, his white mustache barely concealing the smug satisfaction curling his lips. "Miss Sawyer, you are free to go. For now. For now." Those two words landed like a brand on hot skin. Eva stood on legs that had been trembling for the last 2 hours, her hands gripping the back of the wooden chair in front of her, knuckles white as bleached bone. The courtroom in Redemption Creek, Colorado, smelled of sawdust and pipe smoke, and the stale breath of men who had already decided she was guilty of something, even if they couldn't quite prove what. She had testified about her late husband's debts, about the men who had come to collect them, about the fire that had taken the homestead and very nearly taken her life along with it. She had told every word of truth she possessed, and somehow it had felt like confessing to a crime. The gallery behind her stirred and murmured. She could feel the judgment radiating off those bodies like heat from a cast iron stove. A widow at 26, a woman with no property left to her name, a woman who had ridden 40 miles alone on a borrowed horse to testify before a territorial hearing board, because she believed that truth was supposed to mean something in this country. She gathered her shawl and her small traveling bag and turned toward the door, and that was when she heard his voice. "Miss Sawyer." It was low, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need to raise itself to be heard in a crowded room. She stopped without meaning to. There was something in the way he said her name that made stopping feel involuntary, like breathing. Marshal Eli Brenner stood at the edge of the room near the side door, his hat in his hand, and he was watching her with eyes the color of weathered oak, steady and unreadable, and somehow deeply honest in a way that the judge's pale blue eyes had never managed to be. He was broad in the shoulder and lean in the hip, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of red sandstone, and a silver star pinned to his chest that caught the afternoon light coming through the high window. "I'd like a word," he said, "if you'll allow it." Eva looked at him for a long moment. She had learned in the last year of her life to be cautious about men who wanted words with her when no one else was watching, but there was something in his expression that stopped her from simply walking out. "Not danger exactly, something more complicated than that. I have a stage to catch," she said. "I know it," he said. "The Pueblo stage doesn't leave until 4. You have time." He knew the stage schedule. That meant he had been thinking about this moment before the hearing ended. Eva felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, not in fear, but in the particular awareness that came when a situation was larger than it first appeared. "All right," she said. The side room he led her to was small and smelled of leather and old paper, lit by a single window and furnished with nothing more than a desk, 2 chairs, and a rifle rack on the wall. The rifle rack was empty. He closed the door behind them and did not move toward the desk the way a lawman normally would, to put authority between himself and a civilian. Instead, he stood near the window, hat still in hand, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been turning over in his mind for a long time. "I want to say first," he began, "that I believe everything you said in there today." Eva felt the air go out of her. She had not realized until that moment how much she had been holding in, how tightly she had been bracing for the moment when even this last piece of ground would be pulled out from under her. "The judge didn't seem to share your opinion," she said, and she was proud of how steady her voice came out. "The judge has business arrangements with Clayton Holt that go back 8 years, Eli said. "That's not law. That's corruption wearing a robe." She stared at him. "That is a serious thing to say about a territorial judge." "I know it is." He met her eyes without flinching. "I also know it's true." The silence stretched between them, taut and full of implication. Eva set her bag down on the chair nearest her and folded her hands together, studying him. Eli Brenner. She had heard his name before she ever rode into Redemption Creek. People spoke of him in the way people spoke of certain landmarks, with a mixture of respect and wariness. He had served as Marshal of Redemption Creek for 4 years, before that as a deputy in Laramie, Wyoming Territory. He had a reputation for being fair to a fault and dangerous when pushed, which was apparently a combination rare enough to be worth remarking on. "You asked me to stay," she said carefully, "and you said you had something that has nothing to do with law." "I did say that." "Then what is it?" He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something move behind those steady eyes, something that looked, improbably, like nervousness. A man like Eli Brenner being nervous was unexpected enough to make her heart knock sideways in her chest. "Clayton Holt burned your house," he said. "He did it because your husband owed him $300 and because your husband had begun to talk to a federal land surveyor about irregularities in Holt's property claims along the South Fork of the Cimarron River. Thomas Sawyer was a man trying to do the right thing, and it cost him his life." Eva's throat tightened. "You know about Thomas?" "I've been investigating Clayton Holt for 14 months, Eli said. "Your husband was one of 3 men who died in circumstances that pointed directly back to Holt's operation. I couldn't prove it. And then you walked into that hearing today and gave testimony that, if the judge had been honest, would have cracked this whole thing open." "But the judge is not honest." "No," he said. "He is not." She moved to the window beside him, not because she needed to look at the street below, but because the room suddenly felt very small, and she needed to remember that the world outside still existed. The main street of Redemption Creek spread out below them, a thoroughfare of packed dirt and false fronts and hitching posts, horses switching their tails in the June heat, a woman in a calico dress carrying a basket from the dry goods store, a boy chasing a chicken near the livery. The ordinary machinery of a frontier town grinding on without any awareness that inside this little room, something was tilting on its axis. "What are you telling me, Marshal?" she asked. "I'm telling you that I don't want you to get on that stage to Pueblo," he said. "I'm asking you to stay in Redemption Creek, not as a witness, not as a part of any official proceeding." He stopped, and she heard him draw a measured breath. "I'm asking you to stay because I think you deserve to see Clayton Holt answer for what he did. Because I've been trying to build that case alone for over a year and I haven't been able to do it, and because your testimony today, even though it was suppressed, told me that you know things you don't even know you know. And because—" he stopped again. "Because," she prompted. "Because since you walked into that courtroom this morning," he said quietly, "I have not been able to think about a single other thing." Eva Sawyer turned and looked at Marshal Eli Brenner and felt the world rearrange itself around that sentence. She had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 days earlier, riding a borrowed roan mare through the kind of summer heat that pressed down on the Colorado high plains like a physical weight. She had ridden in from the east, from the direction of what had been, until 8 months ago, the Sawyer homestead on the Cimarron River drainage. 47 acres of good grass and river bottom land that Thomas had spent 4 years building, and that had gone up in a fire that everyone in the county seemed perfectly content to call an accident, even though Eva had smelled kerosene in the air as she ran from the burning house in her nightgown at 2 in the morning. Even though Thomas had been found inside with injuries that a coroner willing to look properly would have been deeply troubled by. But coroners, like judges, had to live in the county after their rulings were made, and Clayton Holt owned a great deal of what living in that county involved. She had stayed for a month with Thomas's sister in the town of Cimarron, and then she had spent 3 months in Pueblo working as a seamstress, saving every dollar she could, writing letters to anyone she thought might listen. And then a federal land office official in Denver had written back to say that a territorial hearing had been convened in Redemption Creek and that her testimony would be welcome. Welcome had turned out to be a word with very flexible meaning. She had arrived, and she had found lodging at the boarding house of Mrs. Della Hatch, a stout, warm-tempered woman of 52 who served good coffee and charged fair rates and asked no questions that weren't her business. And on the evening of her first day in Redemption Creek, she had been sitting on the boarding house porch watching the sun go down over the mesa when the marshal had ridden past on a dark bay horse and looked at her, just looked, A single unhurried moment of eye contact before he rode on. She had thought nothing of it then, or had told herself she was thinking nothing of it, which was not quite the same thing. The next morning she had gone to speak to the hearing clerk to confirm her testimony, and she had passed Eli Brenner in the street outside the federal building. He had touched the brim of his hat. She had nodded. They had exchanged 6 words between them, pleasantries about the heat, and she had walked on feeling unaccountably off balance for the rest of the morning. She was not a woman who fell into foolishness over a handsome face. She had been 20 years old when she married Thomas Sawyer, who had been 23, and she had loved him with the steady, practical, clear-eyed love of 2 people building something together. His death had broken something in her that she had not yet properly assessed, partly because she had not yet been still enough to look directly at it. But she was looking at Eli Brenner now, and the thing she felt was not foolishness. It was more frightening than foolishness. It was recognition. "How long have you been a widower?" she asked, and was startled by her own directness. He blinked. "How did you, the way you said that Thomas deserved better," she said. It sounded like someone who knew what it was to lose a person they were building a life with. He was quiet for a moment. 3 years, he said. Her name was Rachel, typhoid fever. We had been married 2 years. "I'm sorry," Eva said, and meant it completely. "So am I," he said, "for your loss and for mine." He looked down at the hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly. "I didn't bring you in here to talk about grief. And yet here we are talking about it." "Yes," he said, and there was something in that single syllable that sounded like relief. "Yes, here we are." Eva looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the street. Somewhere down the block, a blacksmith's hammer rang against iron in a steady, patient rhythm. The afternoon light was shifting, moving gold and long across the floor between them. "If I stay," she said, "and if I help you build your case against Clayton Holt, and if you manage to bring him before an honest judge, there's no guarantee that my testimony will be worth any more than it was today." "That's true," he said. "And if Holt finds out I'm still in Redemption Creek working against him, I will be in genuine danger." "Also true," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. I have no right to ask this of you." "No," she agreed. "You don't." Another silence. She watched something move across his face, a kind of braced resignation, the expression of a man preparing for a refusal he had already decided he deserved. And that expression, more than anything else he had said, was what made up her mind. "But I've been on the run from what happened for 8 months, she said, "and I'm tired of running." She picked up her bag. "I'll need to send a letter to Mrs. Alvarado in Pueblo to let her know I won't be taking my seamstress work back this week. And I'll need to know what it is you think I know that I don't know I know." He looked at her with those weathered oak eyes, and something in them shifted the way light shifts on water. "You're staying." "I'm staying," she said, "for justice, and possibly for other reasons I haven't fully worked out yet." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he controlled it, a brief brightening at the corner of his mouth that looked like it hadn't been there in a long time, and was surprised to find itself there now. "I'll get your room at Mrs. Hatch's arranged for a longer stay," he said. "And tonight, if you're willing, I'd like to show you what I've assembled so far." She nodded and moved toward the door, then stopped. "Marshal Brenner." "Eli," he said. "If we're going to be working together outside official proceedings, you might as well call me Eli." "Eli," she said, and found that the name fit in her mouth like it had always belonged there. "If any part of this ends up being a trap or a game or a way of using me that I haven't understood yet, I will not forgive you." "I know," he said, "and I wouldn't expect you to." She believed him. That was the terrifying and exhilarating thing. She believed him completely. Clayton Holt was not a man Eva had ever met in person, but she knew his type with the bone-deep familiarity of a woman who had grown up watching men like him operate. He was 48 years old, heavy through the chest and jowl, with the kind of wealth that had been assembled through a combination of genuine cleverness and the willingness to do things that clever men were too scrupulous to do. He had come to Redemption Creek in 1876, 3 years before Eva and Thomas had settled on the Cimarron. And in those 3 years, he had built a cattle operation of some 3,000 head, acquired controlling interest in the Redemption Creek Savings Bank, and established himself as the kind of man whose opinion on town matters was sought before any decision was made official. He also, according to the evidence Eli had been quietly assembling for over a year, had been systematically falsifying land surveys to push small homesteaders off river-bottom property that he then incorporated into his own holdings. Thomas Sawyer had discovered the falsification when he'd hired an independent surveyor to settle a fence dispute with a neighbor, and the surveyor, a meticulous young man named Albrecht Weber, had found anomalies in the county land records that pointed clearly to Holt's land office connections. Albrecht Weber had left the county shortly thereafter, under circumstances that Eli described as suspicious, and that Eva suspected were considerably worse than that. 2 other homesteaders who had raised complaints about their boundary surveys had seen their operations destroyed in ways that were always explainable as misfortune. A barn fire here, a well poisoned there, and Thomas Sawyer's house burning with Thomas inside it. Eli spread all of this out on the table in his office that evening, while the lamp burned low between them and Eva sat across from him, with a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow because she had forgotten it was there. He spoke without theatrical flourish, laying down documents and affidavits and hand-drawn maps with the steady, methodical precision of a man who had been living inside this problem for so long that he had stopped being frightened by the size of it and had simply learned to work around it. She listened and she asked questions and she watched him, and she found that watching him think was as interesting as anything he was saying. There was a quality of complete attention in him that she hadn't encountered often, a way of being entirely present with a problem or a person that made the air around him feel different, more charged, more honest. Albrecht Weber, she said, when he had finished laying out the main structure of what he knew. Thomas talked about him. He said Weber was a good man, a precise man, he trusted him. Do you know where he went? I think he went back east, she said. He was from Pennsylvania originally. Thomas said he had family there. She paused. He might be willing to testify if someone could reach him, and if he knew there was real federal protection this time, not just a territorial hearing with a compromised judge. Eli's eyes sharpened. Do you know his town in Pennsylvania? Harrisburg, she said. I'm fairly sure Thomas said Harrisburg. Eli sat back and rubbed a hand across his jaw. I sent a letter to the federal land commissioner in Denver 2 months ago detailing what I had. He wrote back saying he would review it. I haven't heard from him since. I think someone in Holt's network got to him. Or his assistant, Eva said. Yes. You need to go higher, she said. Not the land commissioner. Someone in the federal court system who has no connection to territorial business. A federal circuit judge, he said slowly. If you can get to one, if you can get documents to one. The nearest federal circuit court convenes in Denver, he said. Judge Abraham Whitfield. He's old, but he's honest. I've met him once. He's not a man who can be bought. Then he's the man, Eva said. Eli looked at her across the lamp and the papers and the cold coffee, and the look on his face was complicated in the way that only honest faces ever are. There was gratitude in it, and something that went a great deal beyond gratitude. You just sat down in here and started working on it, he said, as if the fact surprised him. I've been thinking about nothing else for 8 months, she said. I'm very tired of thinking alone. So am I, he said softly. They worked for another 2 hours, and when Eva finally stood and gathered her shawl and said she needed to get back to Mrs. Hatch's boarding house before the old woman locked the door, Eli walked her out into the night air. The street was quiet, the saloon at the far end of the block putting out a low rumble of piano music and conversation, the stars above the mesa enormous and very bright. Eva, he said, when they reached the corner nearest the boarding house. She stopped and looked at him in the starlight. I want you to know, he said carefully, That what I told you this afternoon, what I said about not being able to stop thinking about you since you walked in this morning, I said that because it was true, not to convince you to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because a man trying to use that kind of thing to manipulate a situation doesn't usually stop and tell the woman he doesn't want to use it on her," she said. "And because the expression on your face when you said it looked like you hadn't planned to say it at all." He exhaled slowly. "I hadn't," he said. "I had planned a very reasonable and professional conversation about the case. And instead you told me a true thing." "I told you a true thing," he agreed. "Good night, Eli," she said. "Good night, Eva." She walked to the boarding house door and did not look back, but she was smiling, and she couldn't entirely account for why, except that something tight and closed inside her had opened by a fraction, and the air that had gotten in was unexpectedly clean. The next several weeks in Redemption Creek settled into a rhythm that Eva had not anticipated and found herself grateful for. During the days, she kept herself legitimately occupied by taking in seamstress work from the women of the town, partly for income and partly so that her extended stay would appear unremarkable to anyone in Holt's network who might be paying attention. She set up a small workspace in the parlor of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house with the older woman's enthusiastic approval, and she spent her mornings and early afternoons stitching and listening, because the women who came to her with their mending and their dress alterations were the best source of local intelligence that she had ever encountered. Women knew things. Women always knew things, because men talked freely in front of them on the assumption that it didn't matter, and because women's work took them through every layer of a community in ways that male activity simply didn't. Within 2 weeks, Eva knew which of Holt's ranch hands had been recently hired from outside the territory, and why that was significant, which of the town's merchants were in debt to Holt's bank, and therefore unable to refuse him, and which of the county commissioners had been approached to approve a new land survey that would have pushed 3 more homesteading families off river-bottom land in the Cimarron Valley. She brought all of this to Eli in the evenings, sometimes at his office and sometimes on the boarding house porch after supper when the propriety of the public setting made the meetings appear perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Hatch, who was neither naive nor incurious, watched these developments with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal. "That is a good man," she told Eva one morning over coffee, with the simple certainty of someone stating a well-established fact. "He has been alone too long, same as you." "We're working on a case together, Della," Eva said. "I am aware of that," said Mrs. Hatch serenely. Eli was, in Eva's growing understanding of him, a man of considerable depths who had organized his life around the avoidance of revealing them unnecessarily. He was not cold, but he was contained. He had the marshal's habit of reading a room quickly and moving through it without leaving unnecessary impressions, a kind of deliberate invisibility that served him professionally and had apparently become second nature in the years since Rachel's death. But in the evenings, when it was just the two of them over the maps and the documents and the carefully assembled evidence, something in him relaxed in increments, like ice giving way slowly at the edge of spring. He told her about growing up in Abilene, Kansas, the third son of a horse trader who had brought the family west when Eli was 7 years old, about the schoolteacher who had decided that Eli's stubborn streak was better suited to the law than to the trouble it would otherwise inevitably get him into, and who had told him so with a directness that he had apparently never forgotten. About his years as a deputy in Laramie, and the particular brand of injustice that had driven him out of Wyoming and south to Colorado, a case involving a powerful cattleman and a falsified murder charge leveled against a Ute ranch hand who Eli had known was innocent and had not been able to prove innocent in time. That story made Eva's jaw tighten. "The ranch hand," she said. "What happened to him?" "He was transported to the territorial prison in Laramie," Eli said. "I spent 6 months after I left Wyoming trying to build a case for his appeal. Eventually found a witness who had been too frightened to speak at the time. He was released after 14 months incarcerated. He paused. By then his wife had taken their children back to her family on the Ute Reservation. He had nothing left to go back to. And the cattleman died of a heart attack the following winter, he said, comfortable in his bed with his family around him. The bitterness in that was old and layered, she could hear it, but it had not curdled into cynicism the way bitterness sometimes did. He was still working, still believing that the machinery of justice could be made to turn honestly if someone was willing to push hard enough and long enough. "Is that why you're fighting so hard for this case?" she asked. He considered the question carefully, which she had come to recognize as his characteristic response to anything that deserved an honest answer rather than a reflexive one. "Partly," he said, "and partly because the people Holt has hurt, your husband and the others, they were people trying to do exactly what this country promises you can do. Build something, own something, live honestly. And he took that from them because he could. He met her eyes. That makes me furious." "Quietly furious, but furious." "Quietly furious," she said. "That might be the most accurate description of you I've heard." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Is that how you see me?" "That's one of the ways," she said, and was immediately aware that she had said something more personal than she had intended, and that he was aware of it too. She looked away first, at the map on the table between them. He let her, which was another thing she was learning to appreciate about him. He did not pursue moments of vulnerability the way some men did, with eagerness or with the particular cruelty of someone who understood that exposed things could be used as handles. He simply waited and let her come back to the conversation in her own time. 3 weeks into Eva's extended stay, the situation shifted. One of the county commissioners, a man named Floyd Dunbar, came to Eli's office in a state of visible agitation and told him that Clayton Holt had asked him point blank at the previous night's dinner whether the marshal had any ongoing relationship with the Sawyer woman who had testified at the hearing. Dunbar, who was a weak man but not an entirely dishonest one, had said he didn't know, which was true, and had come to tell Eli about the conversation the following morning because, he said, the way Holt had asked the question had made the hairs stand up on the back of his neck. Eli came to Eva that evening with this information and laid it out without embellishment. "He's suspicious," Eva said. "Yes. That means our time is shorter than we thought." "Yes," he said again. "I need to move faster on the letter to Judge Whitfield in Denver, and I need to find a way to reach Albrecht Weber in Harrisburg." "The telegraph," Eva said. "Can you use the territorial marshal's office in Denver to send a communication directly to the Pennsylvania state authorities? Ask them to locate Weber and determine whether he's willing to cooperate." "That could work," he said, "but it requires me to trust whoever is operating the telegraph line, and Holt has eyes on the local operator, I'm fairly certain." "Then you ride to the next town," Eva said. "Millhaven is 14 miles north. Send from there." He looked at her. "I'd need to leave you here for half a day." "I'm not made of paper, Eli." "I know that," he said, and there was a warmth in it that made her look away again, but differently this time. Not out of discomfort, but out of the need to have a moment with something that felt too large to look at directly. "I'll be fine," she said. "Go to Millhaven." He rode to Millhaven the next morning and came back with a response already waiting for him at the telegraph office there, from the territorial marshal's office in Denver, confirming that a federal courier had been dispatched to locate Albrecht Weber in Harrisburg. The speed of the response suggested that someone in Denver had been waiting for movement on exactly this kind of inquiry, which was either very good news or very bad news, depending on who had been doing the waiting. It turned out, after 2 more days of telegraph exchanges through the Millhaven office, to be very good news. Albrecht Weber was alive, was living in Harrisburg, and was, according to the federal courier who located him, ready and willing to testify. He had been waiting, the courier wrote, for someone official to ask. He had been too frightened to come forward alone, and no one had come to him, and he had been living with the weight of what he knew for nearly a year. Eva read that part of the telegraph message and felt something crack open in her chest that might have been relief or might have been grief, because here was a man who had known the truth and been waiting in silence, and she understood that feeling from the inside out. He just needed to know someone was coming, she said. Yes, Eli said. He was watching her with that particular quality of attention that she had come to think of as his way of seeing, full and unhurried and very careful. That's often how it is. She looked up at him. Is that how it was with you, after Rachel? The question surprised him, she could see that, but he didn't deflect. In a way, he said. When Rachel died, I threw myself into work so completely that I stopped needing anyone to come for me. I thought that was strength. I've since revised that opinion. What changed your opinion? He looked at her for a long moment. You'll think it sounds foolish. I doubt that. A woman walked into a courtroom 4 weeks ago and told the truth with no one in a position of power on her side, and no guarantee that the truth would do her any good, and she stood up there and told it anyway, he said. That changed my opinion. Eva felt the warmth of that move through her like sunlight through water. She held his gaze and let herself feel it without immediately looking for a reason to put it at a safer distance. Eli, she said. I know, he said. This is not the right time. I was going to say thank you, she said. He blinked. Oh, but you were also right, she added. This is not the right time. The smile that broke across his face then was not the controlled, edged thing she had seen before. It was full and real, and it did something remarkable to the lines around his eyes, softened them and deepened them at once, the way strong sunlight does to a landscape. Soon, he said. Soon, she agreed. They sent a formal deposition request to Albrecht Weber through the Federal Circuit Court, going entirely around the territorial court system, and Judge Pruitt's compromised jurisdiction. Judge Abraham Whitfield in Denver proved to be exactly what Eli had promised, old and sharply intelligent and deeply unimpressed by the kind of power that operated at the territorial level when it thought no one important was watching. Within 10 days of the first official communication with his court, Judge Whitfield had dispatched 2 federal deputies to Redemption Creek and had issued a formal notice of federal inquiry into Clayton Holt's land claim operations. The notice was served to Holt at his ranch house on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of July, and by Tuesday afternoon, the entire town of Redemption Creek was vibrating with the news. Eva was at Mrs. Hatch's parlor, stitching a hem for the wife of the dry goods merchant, when the merchant's wife burst in 20 minutes ahead of her appointment with the information that the federal men had come, and that Clayton Holt had turned the color of a beet, and that his attorney, a man imported from Santa Fe, had been seen riding very hard toward the county courthouse. Is it true you had something to do with this? The woman asked, not unkindly, looking at Eva with an expression compounded of curiosity and a certain tentative hope. I testified at the hearing in June, Eva said carefully. My husband voted for Holt in the last commissioner election, the woman said. I've always felt ill about it. If you need anyone else to say something about the way Holt operates, I mean, there are things I could say, things I've heard. I would encourage you to speak to the federal deputies, Eva said. They are who matters now. By evening, 2 more townspeople had approached Eli with information they had been sitting on for months or years, and a third had written a letter directly to Judge Whitfield's office. The federal notice had cracked something open in Redemption Creek the way a struck flint cracks stone, and through the crack light was beginning to come in. Eli came to the boarding house porch that evening and sat next to Eva in the second rocking chair and said, without preamble, 3 more witnesses. Floyd Dunbar, who it turns out knows considerably more than he initially let on. A former ranch hand of Holt's who saw the men leave the property the night Thomas's house burned. And the widow of one of the other homesteaders. Eva closed her eyes for a moment and felt the weight of all those months of carrying this alone begin to redistribute itself across a broader structure. The ranch hand, she said. He saw them. He saw 3 men leave Holt's property on horseback at approximately 11 at night, Eli said. The direction they rode was toward the Cimarron drainage. The date matches. Eva opened her eyes. The stars above the mesa were coming out, the way they always did in that deep summer sky, pouring into the dark with a generosity that still surprised her no matter how many times she saw it. She had grown up in Missouri, where the sky was smaller and the stars more modest. Colorado had given her, among its other harder lessons, the experience of a sky so large it felt like a different kind of truth. "Eli," she said, "yes, I want you to know something." She turned to look at him. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, hat in his hands again, the way he always held it when he was being particularly honest. "Whatever happens with the case, whether Holt answers for it or whether he finds some other way to slither out, I am glad I stayed. I want you to know that." He looked at her steadily. "Are you glad you stayed for the case?" "Partially," she said. "Yes." "And the other part?" "The other part is sitting in the chair next to me," she said. The silence that followed was the most comfortable silence Eva had experienced in over a year, which was itself a revelation, because she had not known until this moment that a silence could be comfortable. She had known silence as absence, as the empty space where Thomas's voice had been, as the echo of a house that no longer existed. This silence was something different. It was full. It was shared. He reached across and laid his hand over hers, where it rested on the arm of the rocking chair. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and he held hers with the deliberate gentleness of someone who understood that some things needed to be handled carefully, not because they were fragile, but because they deserved care. She turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his. They sat like that until Mrs. Hatch came to the door to say that there was pie left from supper if anyone wanted it, took one look at the porch, and went back inside with a sound that was very nearly a coo. Clayton Holt did not go quietly. Eva had not expected that he would, and Eli had planned accordingly. The formal federal investigation moved with the kind of speed that only happens when a judge has decided that a situation has been allowed to fester long enough. Albrecht Weber arrived in Redemption Creek on the 2nd of August, traveling under federal escort from Harrisburg, and he proved to be exactly as Thomas had described him. A thin, precise man in his mid-30s with spectacles, and a surveyor's habit of looking at everything as if he were preparing to measure it. He was also, beneath the methodical exterior, clearly frightened and clearly determined not to let the fear stop him. Eva met him at the federal deputy's office and recognized in his face the particular expression of someone who had been living with a secret for so long that the prospect of releasing it felt both terrifying and desperately necessary. "You were Thomas's wife," he said when Eli introduced them. "I am," she said, present tense, not past. Something in her had decided that this was the correct framing. She was still Thomas's wife in the sense that she had loved him and he had been real, and his death was real, and the person she had been with him was a part of who she was. "He was trying to do the right thing," Weber said. "When he came to me and showed me what he had found, he was so calm about it, as if he simply expected that showing the evidence would be enough, as if systems were honest by default." He paused. "I was less naive than he was, and I ran, and I have lived with that." "You're here now," Eva said. "Yes," he said, "I'm here now." Weber's testimony before the federal inquiry, combined with the statements of the former ranch hand, Floyd Dunbar, and the other homesteading widow, constructed a picture of Clayton Holt's operation that was damning, specific, and thoroughly documented. The falsified land surveys had generated enough paper to fill 2 crates, and Weber, who had spent the months since leaving Colorado carefully organizing his own documentation of the anomalies he had found, arrived with a 2nd crate of his own. Holt's attorney attempted 3 separate procedural challenges to the federal inquiry's jurisdiction, and Judge Whitfield, presiding remotely through written communications with his deputies, dismissed each one with the terse efficiency of a man who had been practicing law for 40 years, and had seen every variation of this particular maneuver before. Holt himself, through his attorney, claimed that any irregularities in the land records were the result of errors by county employees, that he had no personal knowledge of any surveying discrepancies, and that the fire at the Sawyer homestead was a tragedy, but one entirely unconnected to anything involving his business operations. The former ranch hand, whose name was Jesse Caldwell, and who had left Holt's employ 6 months earlier after an argument about back wages, looked at the federal deputies with the steady eyes of a man who had decided that he was done carrying someone else's crimes and described, in careful detail, overhearing Clayton Holt instruct 2 of his men to make sure the Sawyer place stopped being a problem. Permanently. That statement, Eli told Eva the evening after Jesse Caldwell delivered it, was the piece that changed everything. "Is it enough?" Eva asked. "It's enough," he said, and the steadiness in his voice made her believe it. On the 12th of August, 1879, a federal warrant for the arrest of Clayton Holt on charges of land fraud, conspiracy to commit arson, and conspiracy to commit murder was issued by Judge Abraham Whitfield's Federal Circuit Court in Denver. Eli Brenner served that warrant himself. Eva did not watch it happen. She had not asked to watch it happen, because she was not certain that seeing Clayton Holt taken into custody would give her the thing she was looking for, which was not, exactly, satisfaction. She had thought for a long time that what she wanted was justice, clean and simple and complete, and she had come to understand in the past weeks that justice was neither clean nor simple, that it was a laborious and imperfect thing built out of paper and testimony, and the courage of frightened people who decided to speak anyway, and that what she actually wanted, underneath the justice, was for Thomas's death to have meant something. She was sitting in the boarding house parlor when Eli came back, and she heard his boots on the porch and then his knock at the door, and when she opened it and looked at his face, she knew from the expression on it that it was done. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She had thought she might cry, but what she felt instead was something quieter, a deep settling like water finding its level. "He'll be transported to Denver for trial," Eli said. "The Federal Circuit Court will handle it. It could take months. You'll be called as a witness in the formal proceedings." "I'll be there," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know you will." He was still standing on the porch, hat in hand, and Eva looked at him and understood that this was the moment when the shape of things was going to have to be addressed directly. The case that had given them a structure for spending time together and building towards something was no longer the immediate daily emergency it had been. There was no longer a specific reason that she could point to for remaining in Redemption Creek. She had seen this kind of moment coming from a distance for several days, and she had been both looking forward to it and dreading it, the way you dread the moment when a thing you have been holding at the level of implication has to become explicit. "Eli," she said. "I know," he said again. "What do you know?" "I know that the reason you had for staying is no longer as urgent," he said. "And I know that I want to give you a different reason, a permanent one, but that I have no right to ask that and no way of being sure it's what you want. And I know that if you told me you were getting on the next stage to Pueblo, I would spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been, and that this would be entirely my own fault for not saying something sooner and more clearly." He stopped. "So I am saying something now, clearly." Eva felt her heart doing something quite irregular. "Go on," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since approximately 20 minutes into that first evening in my office, when you looked at the map of the Cimarron Valley and started connecting things I had been too close to see, and I have been trying to determine the appropriate time to say so for the past several weeks. I don't know if this is the appropriate time. I suspect there is no appropriate time and that I should simply say it and accept whatever comes next." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her eyes and did not look away, which was, she had come to understand, the most characteristic thing about him. Whatever he felt it honestly, and he let you see it. "I love you too," she said. "I have been attempting to be sensible about it, which has not worked at all." Something moved across his face that was so open and unguarded that it made her breath catch. He reached out and touched her face with one hand very gently, his thumb brushing her cheekbone, and she leaned into it without thinking. "I would like to ask you to stay," he said. "Not for the case. Not for any reason that has anything to do with law. "I know," she said softly. "Is that a yes?" "That is absolutely a yes," she said. He kissed her then, on the boarding house porch in the early evening with the Colorado sky burning orange and pink above the mesa, and it was the kind of kiss that carries the full weight of everything that has been carefully not said for weeks, honest and unhurried and very, very sure. Mrs. Hatch appeared at the parlor window behind them, looked at the porch, and withdrew with an expression of thorough vindication. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing in that period of Eva's life was simple, because real life rarely offers the tidiness of a concluded story when you have reached what feels like an ending. The federal trial of Clayton Holt was scheduled for the following spring, which meant that Eva remained in Redemption Creek through the winter of 1879 and into 1880, which suited her very well. She and Eli were deliberate about the way they conducted themselves. This was 1879, in a small western town where reputation was a practical currency, and both of them had enough respect for each other and for the community they were living in to be careful. They were seen together at church on Sundays and at the community supper that the women of the Redemption Creek Presbyterian congregation organized each month. He came to Mrs. Hatch's for Sunday dinner with some regularity. She brought him food occasionally when he was working late, and the nature of this gesture was understood by everyone in town within approximately 48 hours of the first time it occurred. The town, on the whole, approved. This was something that Eva had not been entirely prepared for, the degree to which a small western community could be quietly, warmly invested in the romantic prospects of its residents. Mrs. Hatch was the most vocal proponent of the match, but she was far from alone. The dry goods merchant's wife told Eva that the marshal had not looked like himself in years, meaning it as a compliment. The blacksmith told Eli apparently that it was about time, which Eli reported to Eva with an expression of resigned amusement. "About time for what exactly?" Eva asked. "I didn't inquire," Eli said. She laughed, and he watched her laugh with that expression she had come to associate with happiness, his, specifically, which was a thing she was still not entirely used to being the cause of. They talked during those months, in the way that two people talk when they are genuinely getting to know each other. Not the careful conversation of early acquaintance, but the deeper, more revealing kind that happens when you have already said the important things and are now filling in the picture on all sides. He told her about his fear that the work would always take more from him than he could sustain, that the particular kind of grinding that came with trying to hold justice together in a place where so many forces were working against it would eventually wear him through. She told him about her fear that grief had changed her in permanent ways, that the woman who had stood in Thomas's burning house and chosen to run rather than turn back, who had chosen survival, was somehow a diminished version of the woman she had been before. Eli looked at her for a long time after she said that. "The woman who ran from a burning house," he said carefully, "had the presence of mind in the middle of terror to smell kerosene and understand that what was happening was not an accident. She rode 40 miles on a borrowed horse to testify at a federal hearing. She sat in a room full of powerful men who wanted her to go away and told the truth anyway. She stayed in a town where she was potentially in danger and built a case that brought a man like Clayton Holt within reach of federal justice." He paused. "That is not a diminished woman. That is a formidable one." She had to look away then, not from discomfort, but because the thing he had said was so exactly what she had needed to hear, had been waiting to hear without knowing she was waiting, that looking directly at him while she processed it felt like too much. "You have a way of saying things," she managed after a moment. "Do I?" he said, and he sounded genuinely uncertain, which was itself endearing. "Yes," she said. "You say true things in ways that make them more bearable. It's a skill. I've never thought of it as a skill. Most skills are like that," she said. "You don't think of them as skills until someone notices them." He proposed to her on a Sunday in November, on the mesa above town, where he had taken her riding on the day before the first real snow of the season. The sky was the particular pewter gray of late autumn, and the air smelled of cold and approaching weather and the dry grass of the high country. And he dismounted from his dark bay horse and helped her down from the roan she had borrowed from the livery, and then stood in front of her, holding both sets of reins, and said, with the direct honesty that was his most constant characteristic, that he wanted to marry her and spend the rest of his life being the kind of man who deserved to. And that he understood if she needed more time, but that he wanted her to know where he stood. Eva took the reins from him, tied both horses to a nearby scrub oak with the efficiency of a woman who had grown up around horses, turned back to him, put both hands on the front of his coat, and said yes before he had finished the question. He put his arms around her and held her with the kind of solidity that she had not experienced in over a year, the physical certainty of being held by someone who was not going anywhere. She pressed her face into his coat and felt the cold air around them and the warmth of him against her, and thought that she was, improbably and completely and without qualification, happy. They were married in December of 1879 in the Redemption Creek Presbyterian Church, on a Saturday afternoon when the snow on the mesa caught the thin winter sun and turned it back to gold. Mrs. Hatch made the wedding cake and cried thoroughly throughout the ceremony. Jesse Caldwell, who had by then found work with an honest rancher north of town, and who had become something of a friend to both of them, stood up as a witness. Albrecht Weber, who had returned to Harrisburg after completing his deposition, but had sent a letter when he heard the news, sent a very warm note of congratulations that arrived 3 days after the wedding. Judge Harlan Pruitt was no longer a judge. He had resigned from his position in October when it became clear that the federal inquiry was going to examine his financial relationships with Clayton Holt, and he had left Redemption Creek quietly and without ceremony, which was perhaps the most dignity-preserving option available to him. Eva wore a dress she had made herself, a deep blue wool with white collar and cuffs, and she walked down the aisle of the little church on her own 2 feet, which seemed to her the right thing, a statement about who she was and how she was choosing this, fully and freely, on the basis of everything she knew about the man waiting for her at the end of it. Eli stood at the front of the church in his good suit coat with his silver star pinned to the lapel because, he said, it was a part of who he was, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise even on his wedding day. And he watched her come down that aisle with an expression of such open and undefended love that several people in the congregation had to look at their shoes for a moment. The Reverend spoke the words, and they said the words back, and when the Reverend said husband and wife, the little church erupted in a noise that was considerably more enthusiastic than strict Presbyterian tradition typically warranted, and Mrs. Hatch used 2 handkerchiefs. They settled into life together with the particular ease and occasional difficulty of 2 people who have both been shaped by loss, and are therefore neither naive about what can happen nor willing to take a good thing for granted. Eli's Marshall's house was a 4-room frame building on the north end of the main street, more solid than handsome, with a kitchen garden in the back that had been entirely neglected. Eva made the garden a project, and found that she had missed the particular satisfaction of making things grow. He built her a larger work table for the kitchen so she could continue her seamstress work, because she had told him that she needed work that was her own, and he had understood this immediately and completely, and built the table without suggesting that perhaps she might not need to work now that they were married. She loved him for that, among the many other things she loved him for. The federal trial of Clayton Holt was convened in Denver in March of 1880. Eva and Eli both traveled to Denver to testify, along with Jesse Caldwell, Albrecht Weber, and the homesteading widow, whose name was Margaret Alcott. It was Eva's first time in Denver, and she found the city simultaneously impressive and slightly overwhelming after months in a small town, all noise and commerce, and the smell of coal smoke and ambition. Judge Abraham Whitfield, who turned out to be a small, spare man of 70 with very white hair and extremely precise handwriting, conducted the proceedings with the unsentimental efficiency of someone who had no patience for the prolonging of injustice. Eva testified for 3 hours over 2 days, and this time there was no compromised judge to suppress what she said, no gallery murmuring with predecided judgment, no sense that the truth was walking into a room that had already decided not to hear it. Clayton Holt was convicted on 6 counts of land fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy, including the conspiracy that had resulted in Thomas Sawyer's death. He was sentenced to 12 years in the federal penitentiary. The sentence was not everything Eva had hoped for. She had hoped for longer. She was honest with herself about that. But it was real and it was enforceable, and it was the machinery of honest justice actually turning. She sat in the courtroom when the verdict was read and felt the tears come, not the desperate kind that had ambushed her in the early months after Thomas's death, but something cleaner. She felt Eli's hand find hers under the gallery bench, and she held on to it and let the tears come until they were done. That evening in the hotel in Denver, she sat by the window while Eli brought her coffee and sat with her in the kind of quiet that 2 people share when they have been through something large together and don't need to analyze it immediately. He would have been glad, Eli said, finally. Yes, she said, he would have. Are you? She thought about this honestly, the way he had always taught her to, by letting the question sit in the air before answering it. Yes, she said, I am. It's not everything. It won't give me back what I lost, but it's real and it's right, and that matters. She looked at him. You made it possible. We made it possible, he said. She shook her head slightly. Don't minimize what you did. You spent 14 months building that case before I ever arrived. You believed in it when no one else was doing anything. And I might have built it for another 14 months without being able to break it open, he said, if a woman hadn't walked into a courtroom and changed the trajectory of everything. She looked at him across the coffee cups and the lamplight and the Denver night outside the window. We are going to spend the rest of our lives arguing about who deserves credit for what, aren't we? Almost certainly, he said, with that full, real smile that still did remarkable things to the lines around his eyes. She laughed and leaned across to kiss him, and somewhere in the streets of Denver a church bell struck 10 o'clock, and the sound of it rang out over the city and faded into the cold, clear March air, marking the hour. They went home to Redemption Creek the following week, and life resumed its shape, the kitchen garden coming back to life as April arrived, the seamstress work steady and satisfying, the evenings on the porch when the weather permitted, the comfortable domestic rhythm of 2 people who have found their equilibrium with each other and take genuine pleasure in it. By summer it was apparent that the kitchen garden was not the only thing in the Brenner household that was growing, and Eva told Eli on a June evening on the porch, with the mesa burning orange and gold in the last light, and watched his face go through approximately 7 different expressions in the space of 3 seconds, all of them variations on joy. Are you well? He asked, immediately and practically, which made her love him all over again. I am very well, she said. I have spoken to Dr. Holcomb. He says early February. Eli reached over and took her hand, the way he always did, with the same deliberate gentleness of that first evening on the porch, when holding her hand had been a new thing and now it was as natural as breathing. Eva, he said, yes, I need you to know something. Tell me. I have been in my life deeply fortunate in a number of respects, he said, but I have never been as fortunate as I am right now, and I want to say that plainly so that I have said it and so that you know it is true. She looked at him, this man who had been quietly furious and quietly grieving and quietly building something honest out of difficult materials for years before she arrived, and she felt the fullness of it, all of it, the loss and the work and the courage and the love, settle into something that was not quite simple but was very, very good. I know, she said, and I want you to know the same. He brought her hand to his lips, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, and the summer evening stretched out around them, wide and warm and entirely their own. The winter came down hard that year, as Colorado winters sometimes did, burying the high plains under several feet of snow in January, and making the world outside the marshal's house into a white and silent landscape that was beautiful in a severe, unsentimental way. Eva spent the coldest weeks close to the stove, continuing her seamstress work and reading the books that Eli brought from the small lending library that the Presbyterian congregation maintained, and he came home every evening with the particular purposeful speed of a man who is eager to be in a specific place. On the 7th of February, 1881, their son was born. He was a healthy, red-faced, profoundly opinionated child who announced his arrival at 4 in the morning with an energy that strongly suggested he intended to take up a great deal of space in the world. Dr. Holcomb declared him perfect. Mrs. Hatch, who had sat up through the labor with Eva, agreed emphatically. Eli held his son with the arms of a man who had not known until that moment how long he had been waiting for exactly this, and stood in the bedroom of the marshal's house in the early morning with snow still falling outside the window, and looked at Eva with an expression that she could not have described in words, but that she knew she would carry for the rest of her life. "Thomas," Eli said. It was a question offered gently. Eva had thought about this during the quiet winter weeks. She had thought about it carefully and with great tenderness for both the living and the dead. "James," she said, "I want him to be himself. But Thomas would have liked that we're here and what we made together, and he would have liked you." "I would have liked him," Eli said. "I know you would have." James Eli Brenner turned out, in the years that followed, to be exactly the kind of child that two people with strong opinions and considerable determination might be expected to produce. He had his father's steadiness and his mother's quickness and a stubbornness that appeared to be entirely his own property. He grew up in the marshal's house, knowing that his mother had ridden 40 miles on a borrowed horse because she believed that truth meant something, and that his father had spent 14 months building a case that no one else believed could be built, and that these were the sorts of things that people did when they were trying to live honestly in the world. Margaret Alcott, the homesteading widow who had testified at the Denver trial, eventually found a way to return to the land in the Cimarron Valley. The property that had been fraudulently taken from her and other homesteaders through Holt's manipulation of the land records was partially restored through the federal court's restitution proceedings, which were slow and imperfect but ultimately substantive. She wrote Eva letters occasionally, and Eva wrote back, and there was between them the particular friendship of people who have been through something terrible together and come out the other side recognizing each other as kin. Albrecht Weber wrote to say that he had resumed his surveying work, that he was doing well, that his wife had been very patient about the whole Pennsylvania period and was glad it was over. He also wrote, in a postscript that Eva found quietly moving, that he was glad he had come back, that the silence he had been living in for those months had been heavier than he had known, and that speaking had made it lighter. He thanked them both and wished them happiness, and said he hoped the frontier was treating them well. Jesse Caldwell married the daughter of the rancher he was working for north of town, a young woman named Clara who was sensible and cheerful, and thought Jesse's stories about his former employer were both horrifying and very useful as cautionary tales. They came to Redemption Creek for the annual community supper every July and eventually bought a small property of their own. And when James Brenner was old enough to have opinions about horses, Jesse was the person he most wanted to go visit. Eli served as Marshal of Redemption Creek for 7 more years, and in that time oversaw the orderly growth of a town that had begun, when he first arrived, as a rough and uncertain settlement and was becoming, slowly and with considerable argument along the way, a genuine community. He dealt with the ordinary difficulties of frontier law, the disputes, and the occasional violence and the slow, grinding work of building order out of chaos, with the same quiet ferocity he had always brought to it. But he came home every evening, and the evenings were the frame around which everything else was built. Their second child, Another boy named Samuel arrived in 1883 and proved to be temperamentally his brother's opposite, serene where James was restless, quiet where James was voluble, but possessed of a watchfulness that his mother recognized as her own. Their daughter, Clara Ellen Brenner, arrived in 1886, named for no one in particular but resembling, according to Mrs. Hatch with great satisfaction, both of her parents in a way that suggested she had been carefully planned by Providence. Mrs. Hatch, who lived to 81 and remained opinionated and warm-hearted until the end, told Clara Ellen at every available opportunity that she had been present on the porch the evening her parents had first held hands, and that she had known from that precise moment that everything was going to be exactly right, and that this was the great advantage of having lived long enough to see a great many things resolve themselves. Eva, listening to this on a Sunday afternoon, when Clara Ellen was 7 years old, and Mrs. Hatch was telling the story for what was certainly the 100th time, looked across the parlor at Eli, who was sitting with James and Samuel playing a card game and giving it the same focused attention he gave everything, and felt the deep, rooted contentment of a life that had been built honestly, out of difficult materials, by people who had decided to tell the truth. He looked up from the cards and caught her looking at him, and the smile that crossed his face was the one she had first seen on the boarding house porch in the summer of 1879, full and real and arrived at from a long distance, and entirely worth the journey. She had come to Redemption Creek with nothing but the truth she had been holding for 8 months, and a willingness to go on holding it in rooms where no one wanted to hear it. She had found, in the process of being heard at last, something she had not known she was looking for, though perhaps she should have recognized it the moment a quiet, steady man with weathered oak eyes had asked her to stay after the hearing was done, and told her he had something that had nothing to do with law. He had, and so had she. And together, in the high country of Colorado, with the mesa burning orange at the end of every summer day, and the stars enormous above it all winter long, and the kitchen garden coming back to green every spring, they had built the kind of life that makes the difficult materials worthwhile. Not a life without shadows, because no honest life is without shadows, but a life full of light and full of trust, and full of the particular richness that comes when two people who have known loss decide, with their eyes open, to choose each other completely. That was enough, more than enough. That was everything.